joked, they laughed with her, even if the joke carried no humor. There was calculation in every tilt of her glass, every lift of her chin, every precise pause before she spoke. She had built an empire on that precision. She had earned the kind of reputation that made her untouchable. But under the weight of a dozen champagne flutes, that precision began to fray. At first, it was subtle, a small stumble quickly masked by a laugh, a glass raised too quickly, the bubbles spilling just slightly onto her wrist. Most chose not to see it. They turned their faces away, pretending the center of their universe wasn't wobbling on its axis because Isabel Rowan was not supposed to falter. Not here. Not now. And yet the fire of her dress flickered differently as the night stretched on. What once looked like command now hinted at weariness. What once felt untouchable suddenly looked fragile. She moved through the shimmering crowd with a grace that was beginning to slip. The rhythm of her heels lost their perfect tempo against the marble floor. By midnight, her balance was no longer something she could simply will into place. Isabel Rowan, the CEO who bent conversations and futures with a single glance, stood at the edge of the ballroom, glassy-eyed, her hand brushing the doorframe as if the marble itself was the only thing keeping her upright. In that moment, beneath the lights and the music and the whispers that refused to carry, the untouchable woman everyone feared looked, for the first time, human. At the far edge of the ballroom, where the glow of the chandeliers softened into shadows, stood Daniel Archer, 32 years old, his suit pressed but plain, his shoes polished yet worn at the edges. He held nothing more than a glass of water in his hand, while others floated from circle to circle, laughing too loudly, reaching for another pour of champagne. Daniel remained still, not because he was shy, but because he had no reason to join them. His life didn't orbit around power or appearances. His world, his heart, belonged to a little girl named Maddie, sleeping peacefully miles away under the careful watch of the neighbor he trusted. Daniel had promised himself years ago that he would never waste nights chasing hollow approval. He had learned the hardest way possible that life could shift in a single phone call. The night his wife's laughter had been swallowed by the sound of tires on wet pavement. The night a drunk driver had carved a line straight through his future. Since then, every fizzing glass, every careless toast carried the weight of that loss. So he stayed sober, not out of discipline alone, but out of devotion, because Maddie deserved a father who showed up steady and whole every single morning. He watched the gala with quiet eyes, the sequins and silk, the forced laughter echoing off marble walls. To most in that room, the night was survival. To him, it was an obligation, another line on the list that kept paychecks steady and food on the table. He wasn't there to impress Isabel Rowan or to be noticed at all. He was there because attendance was mandatory. His shoulders carried the weight of responsibility rather than ambition, and every glance at his watch was a silent reminder that bedtime stories had already passed without him. Yet, even as his mind wandered home, he couldn't help but notice her, the woman in red, commanding the room and unraveling beneath it at the same time. The crowd might have turned their eyes away, but Daniel's gaze, steady and unflinching, caught the subtle tremor in her step. The glass lifted one too many times. Where others saw only power, he saw the edges of exhaustion. Where others feared her, he recognized something different, fragility that no one dared to admit. The contrast between them was almost cinematic. Isabel, draped in firelight, her empire built on sharp intellect and harder choices. Daniel in the shadows, with his quiet strength carved from grief and fatherhood. She lived in a world of excess, surrounded by people who wanted something from her. He lived in a modest apartment, his evenings filled with the laughter of a child who wanted nothing more than her father's arms around her. And though their worlds seemed galaxies apart, fate was already beginning to close the distance. Daniel tightened his grip on the water glass, condensation slipping between his fingers. The sound of laughter and the clinking of crystal blurred into background noise. He was thinking of Maddie, her small chest rising and falling beneath the quilt his late wife had sewn, the soft curls of her hair pressed against her pillow. She was the pulse beneath every decision he made, the anchor that kept him grounded in a room full of people drifting on currents of ambition. Across the ballroom, Isabel's laugh rang out again, sharp, uneven. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to be here. Yet something told him that the night was shifting, that soon he would be forced to step out of the shadows. For now, though, he stayed where he was, a silent witness at the edge of splendor, holding nothing more than water in a sea of champagne. Daniel's hand tightened around the glass, the cool water pressing against his palm as if to remind him of the choice he had made long ago. To the people around him, champagne was a celebration, a sparkle and crystal, a promise of power and laughter. But to Daniel, every rising bubble was a warning. He couldn't look at it without remembering the night his world had splintered. Emily had been his anchor, the kind of woman whose laughter filled a room before she even stepped inside it. That night, years ago, she had called to say she was on her way home. He remembered the sound of rain against the windows, the steady hum of the refrigerator in their small kitchen, and Maddie's soft breaths from the crib in the other room. And then silence, a stranger's voice replacing hers, words he would never forget. There had been an accident, a drunk driver, a life stolen in the flash of headlights on wet asphalt. Since then, alcohol had never been indulgence, never a temptation. It was a marker carved in stone of what reckless choices could cost. He hadn't touched a drop since that night, not because he was afraid of losing control, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Maddie ever seeing her father stumble, or worse, vanish the way her mother had. She deserved better. She deserved safety, stability, mornings filled with pancakes and bedtime stories. Not excuses drowned in liquor. As he stood at the edge of the gala, watching Isabel's glass refill again and again, unease settled deep in his chest. To everyone else, she was untouchable, a flame wrapped in red silk. But Daniel could see it, the slight falter in her steps, the sharper edges in her laughter, the way her pupils lagged a moment too long. He recognized the slope she was standing on because he had lived in the ruins at the bottom of it. He remembered the funeral, the way rain slid off black umbrellas like tears that refused to end. He remembered holding Maddie, barely a year old, while people whispered condolences that fell flat against his skin. He remembered swearing to himself that night. Alcohol would never again have a place in his home, in his life, in the world his daughter would grow up in. And he had kept that promise. One steady day after another. Now across the room, Isabel was unraveling in front of a crowd that refused to see it. They admired her fire but ignored the smoke. Daniel's jaw tightened as he followed her with his eyes. He didn't pity her, but he couldn't look away either. He knew too well how quickly a stumble could become a fall. Around him, the music swelled, laughter rose, and the clink of glass echoed like static. But Daniel stood still, holding fast to his water, his silence, his memories. The room celebrated power. He remembered loss. The crowd sought Isabel's attention. He sought only the steady rhythm of his daughter's breath waiting at home. Yet, beneath it all, an unease stirred, whispering that tonight might demand more from him than quiet observation. By the time the music thinned and the last of the champagne had gone flat, the ballroom no longer sparkled. What had begun as a storm of laughter and glass now echoed with the hush of heels slipping toward the exit. Guests eager to disappear before the weight of their boss's shadow followed them home. The chandeliers still burned above, scattering light across polished marble. But the air felt different, emptied of its earlier bravado. At the center of it all, Isabel Rowan remained. The woman who had owned every glance now seemed a fraction smaller beneath the golden glow. Her assistants had vanished, her chauffeur nowhere in sight. For the first time in memory, she stood without an entourage, without the careful choreography that usually framed her nights. The glass in her hand trembled just enough for Daniel to notice, her laugh rising sharp, uneven, before dissolving into silence. When she moved toward the grand doors, her stride lacked its familiar precision. The rhythm of her heels, once a metronome that commanded attention, faltered against the marble. She reached for the frame as though the weight of her empire had suddenly settled on her shoulders all at once. People saw, of course, they always saw, but heads turned quickly. Conversations restarted in false bursts of chatter, eyes pretending to glance elsewhere. To acknowledge her weakness was to risk sharing in it, and no one in that room was willing to take that risk. No one, except the man at the edge. Daniel lingered near the exit, water glass empty in his hand, his body already angled toward the door. ready to leave this glittering theater of ambition. But when his gaze landed on Isabel, unsteady and alone, something inside him refused to follow the crowd. He had lived too long in the aftermath of people turning away, too long in the silence left behind when no one stepped forward. He couldn't walk past her. Not tonight. He set the glass on a nearby tray and straightened, his movements deliberate, calm. Each step toward her carried the quiet weight of choice, not obligation. As he closed the distance, he kept his voice low, gentle enough not to carry across the marble hall. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone steady, respectful, but firm. "Do you need a ride?" Isabel turned, her pupils slow to find him. Recognition flickered, blurred by the haze of champagne. Her lips curved into a bitter smile, the kind that lacked her usual precision. "Williams," she slurred, using his last name as though formality might shield her. Then softer, almost mocking herself, "The single right." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his jaw steady. "Yes, let me drive you home. It's late. It's not safe." Her pride rose like a shield, even dulled by alcohol. "I don't need your help. I have drivers, cars, everything." She gestured vaguely toward the valet stand, now empty, deserted like the ballroom itself. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "Not tonight, you don't," he said quietly. There was no judgment in his tone, only a calm certainty that left little room for argument. "Please trust me." For a long moment, Isabel stared at him, the silence stretching between them like a test. Then, with a frustrated sigh, the kind that sounded more like surrender than defeat, she let her hand drop from the marble frame. Without another protest, she allowed Daniel to guide her forward, her steps uneven but steadier beside him in that fragile walk toward the door. Beneath chandeliers that had witnessed her rise and now her falter. Isabel Rowan's power looked different. It wasn't in the fire of her gown or the sharpness of her eyes. It was in the simple act of letting someone see her weakness, if only for a moment. The night air outside was sharp, cutting through the lingering perfume of the ballroom. Isabel's heels clicked once more against the marble before she sank reluctantly into the passenger seat of Daniel's sedan. The door closed with a muted thud, sealing her inside a world that did not belong to her. No polished leather, no tinted glass, no hum of a chauffeur waiting for orders, just fabric seats, the faint scent of pine from a clipped air freshener, and a dashboard worn from use. Daniel slid behind the wheel, fastening at his seatbelt with a quiet efficiency. He glanced at her once, then forward again, his voice steady. "You'll want yours on," he said softly. Isabel bristled at the suggestion, her pride reflexive, but her fingers obeyed. The click of the buckle echoed louder than the fading jazz still ringing in her ears. As the car eased away from the curb, hotel lights receded into the rear view, swallowed by the darker pulse of Chicago streets. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, filled by the hum of the engine and the rattle of a loose coin in the cup holder. Isabel leaned her head against the cool window, neon lights smearing past like paint-brushed over glass. And then, almost to herself, her words slipped free. "Everyone thinks success is glamorous," she murmured, her voice softer than Daniel had ever heard. "That power makes you invincible." A dry laugh caught in her throat. "But it's lonely. They don't see me, they see the CEO, not the woman." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, though his gaze never left the road. He let a pause stretch before answering, his tone quiet. "I think everyone has their battles. Some just hide them better than others." Her eyes flicked toward him, sharper now, curiosity breaking through the haze. "And what's yours, Archer?" He hesitated, the way a man does before reopening an old wound. His knuckles whitened against the wheel, his breath measured. When he finally spoke, the words were low, deliberate, carrying the weight of years. "I lost my wife. Drunk driver. Since then, my battle is making sure my daughter grows up safe, with someone who won't let her down." The words cut through the fog of champagne like cold water. Isabel blinked, the haze in her eyes clearing for a moment. Sobered not by will, but by the quiet force of his truth. She turned, studying him, not as the single father employee who stood at the edge of her meetings, but as a man carved by grief, refusing to surrender to it. She shifted slightly in her seat, the sequins of her gown rustling against the worn fabric. And you just carry that alone. Her voice was almost fragile, as though admitting her own fear. Daniel didn't look at her, but there was no bitterness in his tone, only resolve. It's not about me, it's about Maddie. She deserves to grow up in a world steadier than the one I was given that night. The city lights stretched ahead, endless ribbons of gold and red. But inside the car, something quieter took shape. Two lives, one hardened by loneliness, the other by loss, brushed against each other in unspoken recognition. Isabel rested her head back, the fire of her gown dimmed now against the simplicity of his presence. For the first time that night, she looked at Daniel Archer not with calculation, not with authority, but with a flicker of something rare. Respect. The elevator chimed softly as Daniel guided Isabel through the lobby of her building, his arms steady beneath hers. The marble floors reflected their steps, chandeliers overhead scattering light across polished stone. The concierge glanced up with a start, then wisely looked away. Even here, Isabel's reputation followed her. Untouchable, commanding. But tonight her balance leaned against Daniel's quiet strength. When the elevator doors opened to her penthouse, the contrast struck him. Glass walls framed a skyline that glittered like spilled diamonds. Sleek furniture sat in perfect symmetry, every surface immaculate. It was a palace in the sky, but to Daniel, it was only a place she needed to be safe for the night. He didn't linger on the wealth. He had long stopped measuring himself against lives like this. His only concern was getting her through the door without falling. Sit, he said gently, easing her onto a white sofa that seemed too pristine for comfort. Isabel exhaled sharply, one hand pressing against her temple, as if the night itself weighed heavy on her skull. Without a word, Daniel crossed the room, his steps quiet against the polished floor. He filled a crystal glass with water at the kitchen sink and set it carefully on the low table before her. You'll feel better after this, he murmured. His tone was neither commanding nor deferential, but simply human. Isabel's eyes fluttered up to him, glazed yet searching. Why are you helping me? Her voice was rough at the edges, frayed by champagne and pride. You could have left. You could laugh about this tomorrow with the others. Daniel's expression didn't change. He stood tall but calm, his hands loose at his sides. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who had lived what he spoke. Because I know what it's like when no one's there. The simplicity of the words struck harder than any grand speech could. For a moment, the armor she had worn for years, polished, flawless, impenetrable, softened into something fragile. She stared at him, the silence stretching long enough to reveal what she didn't say. That kindness, this unassuming, was rarer than power. Daniel didn't press the moment. He didn't linger to see if she would drink the water, didn't wait for gratitude or acknowledgement. He only gave her space to breathe. Good night, ma'am, he added softly, respectful as ever. Then he turned toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him was gentle, almost careful, as if he understood she needed silence more than company. Isabel sat alone in the vast quiet of her penthouse, staring at the untouched glass, condensation already forming a faint ring on the table. She wondered when the last time someone had thought first of her well-being, not her image. For a woman who had built her empire on control, that realization was disarming. And yet, beneath the shame, beneath the fog of champagne, a single truth lingered in the space he had left behind. She had not been alone tonight. Sunlight spilled across the penthouse, too bright for the state Isabel found herself in. She winced, pressing a hand to her temple. The memories of the night before threaded themselves back together in fragments. The laughter that had turned sharp, the stumble at the ballroom doors, the weight of a steady arm guiding her forward, and then him, Daniel Archer. Her gaze drifted to the low glass table where the crystal glass still sat untouched. A faint ring of dried condensation circled beneath it, a quiet reminder that someone had thought first of her well-being, not her image. It was such a simple thing. Water in a glass. But to Isabel, it felt heavier than the endless bottles of champagne